Hello everyone and welcome to today's lecture. In this lecture we're going to be covering Introduction to Trauma and ACEs. Throughout the slides you'll find additional links to videos and articles. Please make sure to look at those. They're going to be able to support your understanding of the topics for the day. Okay, let's get started and talk about what is stress. Stress is how our brains and our bodies are responding to the demands and the challenges and events that are happening within our environments. And we respond physically, emotionally, or psychologically to these stressors. And oftentimes when we hear the word stress, we think that this is only a negative thing. But sometimes stress can be good for us and it can be motivating. But what happens is when we have too much stress that occurs within either a short or long period of time, we can have long-term effects on our health. And stressors can occur one time or in a short-term occurrence or even happen repeatedly over time. And this is when we get into the different levels of what stress looks like. So routine stress, acute stress, and traumatic stress. And we're going to dive deeper into traumatic stress, trauma, traumatic events. That's where we're going to focus our attention for the remainder of the lecture. But let's bring our attention back to a one-time or short-time occurrence of an instance of a stressor. Routine stress. This is something that many of us encounter on our day-to-day routines, everyday normal stressors. So we think about school, work, or family, or other daily responsibilities. Often many of us are sitting in traffic when we're on our way to work, and this can be a little bit stressful, but we know that this is a one-time-a-day occurrence, maybe two, because if you're going, back and forth between work, and it's a short-time occurrence. We understand that this is going to be routine. We can prepare for it. It's something that happens on the day-to-day. We can also set in place ways that we could avoid this stress or make this stress a little less intimidating for us as we're going about our days. And then the next level is acute stress, and this is something that's brought on by a sudden negative change, and this varies depending on the person and their life experiences and their events. All stress is like that as well. It's dependent on the person and what's going on in their lives. And so this could be something like losing a job, having a divorce, or even experiencing a personal or illness of a friend or family member. And then next, the last level is traumatic stress, and this is experienced by a major accident, natural disaster, or event. And what often happens is that a traumatic stress response is occurring over a long period of time or repeatedly, or there is a lack of a buffer or support system during this time, and then this can lead to trauma, which we're going to get into later. In addition to the kinds of stress that we might be experiencing depending on the longevity, we also can categorize stress within different types. And so positive, tolerable, and toxic stress are the key words here that we're going to discuss. With positive stress, we are seeing a brief increase in heart rate, mild elevations in our stress hormones. So this is something that is temporary, and yes, we may feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it could be something where our bodies are excited. We're going on a roller coaster or trying something new for the first time. We have a flutter of emotion when we're hanging out with somebody we enjoy spending time with, or maybe a person comes around the corner and surprises us. So there may be positive instances where we have fluctuations in our heart rate or our body responds to stress. And the key thing here with positive stress is that there's also a supportive relationship set in place. So maybe someone did scare a child or they got spooked when a new person came into the room, but that mild elevation of stress hormone responses can be brought back down to a relaxed level because they have a supportive adult to talk about what was going on and say, hey, I know that was a little bit scary. Somebody came around the corner and they frightened you. I know that that made you a little bit uncertain about, going into that next room, but I'm here to support you and we can go together. And then moving into tolerable stress, we also have a buffer of supportive adults. So tolerable stress is a little bit more serious. We see that there are temporary stress responses. Our body is in a greater degree of activation of our stress alarm systems, and we are a bit more frightened, and there is the potential for a child to be more injured or more scared, something serious is happening. So maybe we have lost a loved one, a parent has died, and this is a serious event in our lives and it's causing stress, whether it's in a short period or long period of time, but this stress is manageable. It's tolerable because we have the support from another adult within our lives in order to create a safe space for us. And even though we are going through something that is extremely stressful and it can cause us to have fluctuations in our mental health and our abilities to engage in day-to-day living, we have somebody supportive to be there and to help us get through this experience, even though it's causing us distress. Now, unfortunately, once we move into toxic stress, we see that our stress response systems are constantly going and activated, and they're prolonged. And unfortunately, we see that there is an absence of a buffer or a supportive relationship, a protective adult that can be there to cater to our needs. And oftentimes we see that when children are experiencing toxic stress, this comes with some form of physical or emotional abuse. We see that there's potential instances for neglect or caregiver substance abuse. We also might see that natural disasters are occurring or economic hardships. So there's many different things that could lead to toxic stress. But the big key difference here between positive and tolerable and toxic is that positive and tolerable stress have a supportive adult who can help the child navigate the stress responses, help the child to overcome and be resilient through this type of stress. Whereas toxic stress, although it's prolonged and there could be a potential for somebody to be there, they're not. And whether this is that they're not able to, or there's a longevity period where someone cannot be present to protect the child, this then leads to some changes within brain architecture, response times, chemical reactions within the brain, as well as increased cortisol and adrenaline levels that are persistent. And so in the event that something occurs that would be normally a positive stressor, a child who's experiencing toxic stress, their stress responses are all over the place. And so I do want you to take a peek at the 3 links that I have here. The experiences build brain architecture and the toxic stress derails healthy development. Those are both videos that can be supportive of your understanding of what is stress, how stress can change our brain architecture, as well as what does brain architecture actually look like? What types of experiences are going to be supporting and changing chemicals within the brain, and what kinds of experiences do we need in order to have healthy stress responses. And then the last link is one that helps you to better understand toxic stress as well as positive and tolerable, and just kind of noticing the differences within the different types of stress. On this slide, I wanted to share a little bit of information on what might cause stress for a child. We're going to deepen our understanding on this later on, as well as in future lectures, but just to kind of set us up for some things to come: unreasonable expectations or forced compliance, social problems, conflict over possessions, abuse and assault, the environment, and unmet physical needs. So like I mentioned, we are going to be going over these in more detail, but it's important to recognize that there are many different things within a child's environment, as well as the environment itself, that could be causing potential stress. So for example, if we're looking at unreasonable expectations or forced compliance, we may see that adults do not have a secure understanding of developmentally appropriate practices and know how to support a child and guide them through day-to-day tasks, or even if there's a conflict that arises, and we may see that they have unreasonable expectations for how a child should behave. And also we may see that an adult is forcing a child to do something without their permission or without respecting their boundaries or their body, and this can cause a lot of stress for the child, especially if they are feeling that they are not respected, not welcome, that the adult does not have the utmost regard for them, nor that they feel that they can fully cooperate and provide the adult with what their expectations are. Especially if developmentally a child is not able to meet certain expectations, this can be extremely stressful on their bodies and their brains, and then this can lead to additional issues, which we'll discuss later, of what happens when we're experiencing stress. Social issues or problems. So within the school setting, potentially bullying could be occurring, and this can cause a child stress, or even just being able to interact in their environment with others. Maybe they have a language barrier within the classroom setting, and this can cause stress when trying to interact, or maybe they are temperamentally more shy or uncertain about sharing out their ideas. And so this can cause social problems when trying to communicate their needs with their teacher or other adults or children. Also, conflict over possessions. So we may see that different types of items within the home or even within a school setting, there could be conflicts over this. So this could be if you're in two different households. This could be if you have siblings. Again, this could be within the school setting. Also, we will discuss more instances of abuse and assault and what that might look like within the home setting or even other types of settings such as school or within a setting between two children or multiple children, and how this can cause immense amounts of stress. And do consider, again, as we were discussing, the longevity of the stress. So what kind of stressor it is, and also what the longevity is. So is this a one-time occurrence, a short-time occurrence? Is this happening repeatedly over time? And what type of stress is this? And when this stress is occurring, depending on what might be causing it, does a child have a buffer set in place? So for example, we'll go back to the social problems. If bullying is occurring at school and the child has an adult that they trust at home or even trusting their teacher, and they go to them with this social problem, and the adult can be a buffer and support the child and help to manage this stress, as well as to create a opportunity for the child to have a safe and supportive environment where they can then go to school and not be afraid of this stress. Is that something that's set in place? And if it's not, what are the differences between a child who does have a supportive adult as a buffer and a child who doesn't? And that's what we're really going to deep dive into. And the last two, environment and unmet physical needs. So these could go hand in hand if a child does not have a secure place to live or a secure place to bathe or go to sleep at night. This could be a combination of environment and unmet physical needs. We could also see an overlap between abuse and assault and environment. We could also see the mental health decline of a parent or caregiver within the environment. So there's many different things that could be occurring within the environment that may cause stress for the child. This could be the location of where the child is housed or goes to school. Maybe they live in a high poverty neighborhood, and so they don't have the same types of resources or access to a safe space to go between school and home. Other unmet physical needs could be that the child is not catered to emotionally, and so they could have unreasonable expectations that require the child to not cry and to suck it up, and the child is needing additional comfort. Or even for our infants or young children, they may not have the ability to take care of themselves, and so the adult within their lives may or may not be capable or unwilling or unable to do this, and so a child is maybe not being regularly bathed or diapers changed, not being fed properly. So there's many different things where physical needs could not be appropriately met, and like I said, we'll dive deeper into these points a little bit later on. Now that we have a better understanding of what stress is, the different types of stress, and some things that may be causing stress, we want to make sure we also have an understanding of how our bodies and brains actually respond to stress. So as we were talking about earlier, we respond in a variety of different ways, physically, emotionally, and psychologically, and we often hear these terms called flight, flight, or freeze, or our fight or flight response. And this is actually happening within the brain, and it's happening within the amygdala area. So our amygdala is part of the brain that helps us to process emotions, and particularly is connected to fear and to stress. And fear is actually one of the first emotions that we are able to grasp onto as early as 9 months. So consider that we have responses to stress very early on in our lives. And there are a couple different variations that have come about newly. Most of the time we hear fight or flight response, but the common 3 Fs are fight, flight, or freeze. Another one that I have recently discovered is fawn. So kind of keep in mind that there are maybe different articles and readings out there that you may see that have additional F words that help us to better understand behavioral responses to stress. But basically, this is how our bodies are naturally responding, and we've come up with these terms to help us to indicate what those terms actually mean. And we'll get into those on the next slide. But really, we see that this is true, that our bodies have different behavioral responses to temporary stress or the result of trauma. So we have different ways that we're responding to the events that occur within our lives. And as I mentioned previously, if we have instances of prolonged stress that could be toxic and lead to trauma, we're seeing that there are changes in our brain architecture, our response times, the chemical responses, our cortisol and adrenaline levels. And so do consider that depending on the type of stress that we are receiving, we may have different responses, or those response systems, those alarm bells of when we need to fight, flight, or freeze may be going off at different times. They may not be going off at appropriate times, or we may be in a constant mode of fight, flight, or freeze, even if there are no stressful events or occurrences happening. And so we do want to recognize that these responses can be elicited by true danger or even being triggered by an environmental cue that was associated with past danger. So for example, if a child who was in a home where there was gun violence is then experiencing a loud noise within the classroom, such as an alarm bell or the sound of something going off loudly of popping, and this brings them back to an experience within their life where there was true danger, they may have a behavioral response to this where they might go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And their amygdala is telling them, ooh, something stressful is happening. I'm in danger, and I need to make sure that I'm responding appropriately. And I have included another link for you, so understanding the stress response. This is an article link. I highly recommend looking at this so that you can better connect what we're talking about. And then, like I mentioned, we're going to talk more in depth on the next slide about the 3S. So this is continuing behavioral responses to stress and getting more into the fight, flight, and freeze response. And so I've included some different types of behaviors that we commonly will see when a person or a child is engaging in their fight, flight, or freeze response system. And so oftentimes our fight response is just how it says. We're fighting. We are feeling that danger is going to be best met with putting up a fight. So hitting or biting, we often may go into a rage. And during this type of stress response, it is difficult to be calmed down. We also might see that children may engage in self-harm or verbal abuse. So they may be saying, I hate you, or hitting you, or hitting themselves. They might say things that are not typical of them when they are not within their fight response system. There's also a need for control during this time. So I am the one who's going to protect myself, and there's no one else who can protect me except myself in this moment. They may come off as rude. So again, that verbal abuse could come into play. And this is a protective strategy. So all of these behavioral responses to stress are in order to protect ourselves. And so whether we're going into fight, flight, or freeze, it depends on the person. It depends on what their body feels they need in that moment in order to protect themselves. It is a protective barrier to something in the environment that is causing them potentially harm. And even though there may not be harm in the environment, this is when we have to consider what kind of stressor it is, what types of stress the child has experienced before, what is the cause of the stress, what is a child's typical engagement within their environment, what kinds of buffers have they had in place. If a child has never had an adult to support them during a stressful moment within their life, it can be very difficult to help them to come out of one of these stress response systems. Now with flight, this is when they're trying to leave, they're fleeing the situation. They're not going to put up a fight, but they would rather run away or walk away. So a child may try to go hide. They might be hyper vigilant. Maybe they have difficulty with sleeping or eating. They're more fearful. So if something does jump out and scare them, instead of trying to fight whatever jumps out and scares them with biting or hitting, they may try to run away or remove themselves from the situation. We may see more mood swings, excessive worrying, as well as regression in skills they've already mastered, or even having accidents with going to the bathroom. And then within the freeze response, just as it states here, they're freezing up. They are not able to fight, nor able to flight and run away. And so we may see that they refuse to talk or ignore requests. They don't listen to what we're saying. And even when we're trying to help to calm them down in this response, they may not be able to come out of this freeze stress response. And so they might give up quickly. So if they're engaging in an activity and it causes them a mild amount of stress, they may freeze up and not be able to function anymore in that moment. They might be resistant or refrain from trying different types of things, especially new things. Also, they might be overly dependent on others. And so if they are frozen and unable to do things for themselves, an adult might come in and be that buffer. And so they depend on them extremely heavily. We also might see other responses such as limited eye contact, sensitivity to sensory aspects of the environment, sounds, touch, things like that. We also might see that there's an overreaction of simple situations. They might freeze up when they're presented with a question that they don't know the answer to, even though the answer could potentially be very simple. But in that moment, something is causing the child stress, whether it is something that's going on in their environment, or maybe a thought that has occurred, or even something that they have noticed that could be potentially causing them to freeze up. Also, we see that children who are more likely to freeze up lack confidence. And so I did include 2 videos here that help us to better understand the fight, flight, or freeze. The first one is a shorter video that just gives you some of that quick information on what the behaviors actually might look like real time. And then the second one is a longer video of a TED Talk and trying to help you to connect what we're learning in lecture with our own body's defense mechanism. So really kind of stepping outside of just knowing fight, flight, or freeze and thinking about for ourselves personally during times of stress, how do we respond? What does that look like? And so the importance of recognizing our own body's defense mechanism is a useful tool when we are working with young children who've experienced trauma and who are going through stressful events, because we may have the same type of stress response as a child. And if we both freeze up or we're both in fight mode, we may see that we're butting heads with a child when we're both trying to fight during a stressful moment. So oftentimes we may see that during a stressful time, maybe we're running late for the day and we're yelling at the child, come on, hurry up, we got to put our shoes on. And the child is then feeling the stress from how you're stressed out, and then they respond back with yelling or aggression and need for control. And so if we do have the same types of behavioral stress responses, they may work in our favor, but they also might fight against us when we're trying to support a child. So it is important for us to recognize what our responses are so that we can find healthy coping mechanisms for when we do engage in stressful times, and what we can do to support a child or children when things are happening. All right, so now we're going to move on to what is trauma, and your text does a beautiful job of defining this, and so I'm going to read this quote from the text. Trauma is defined as an experience that threatens life or physical integrity and overwhelms the capacity to cope. And so this is something that I want you to sit with and take in for just a moment. And the big key piece here is overwhelms the capacity to cope. So an individual who's experiencing trauma does not have the capacity to cope with that experience. And so trauma can cause increased levels of toxic stress, which is connected to life-threatening events, violence, loss, or danger, as we were talking about. Also, we see that the way that a person perceives an event of trauma does influence lifelong outcomes. So there are many different types of trauma. There are different ways that individuals experience trauma. Again, we are considering the longevity of what that looks like. And we also see that whether or not there is a supportive and nurturing caregiver, teacher, adult, someone in our lives, we may have different types of influences lifelong, and those outcomes look very different, especially when we're considering if we're working with young children who have experienced trauma or a traumatic event, and children who are currently experiencing trauma. So we may see that there was a traumatic event or an instance of trauma and experience that was life-threatening, and a child during that time did not have the capacity to cope, but maybe they have overcome that trauma, and now we're working with them in a reformed and resilient setting. But we may be interacting with children who are currently experiencing trauma with their family members right now in this moment. And so how do we create support for those children, for all children who have or are experiencing trauma. And this is a great article link that gives you, this one is a video link that gives you more information, specifically diving more deeply into the brain. So we were talking about the brain earlier and the importance of recognizing that the brain is impacted significantly by stress and by trauma. And so do consider that children of different ages may have different experiences with trauma and what that looks like. And we will talk more later on about the different kinds of impacts that trauma can have on a child's developing brain. And so we see that they are particularly vulnerable to trauma because of the rapid development of their brains, especially during birth to 3 years old, birth to 8 years old. During this time frame of early childhood, there's rapid brain development, especially birth to 3. That is a big key area of when rapid brain development is happening, and early childhood trauma can be associated with reduced brain cortex. And so we see that our brain is responsible for many complex functions, such as memory, attention, our thinking abilities, our language development. And so we do want to consider, does this child have a supportive adult to nurture them through this experience of trauma? And what does that look like? How are these different parts of the brain impacted? Now that we have a better understanding of what stress and trauma are, I wanted to talk about ACEs. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And so when we're thinking about trauma, trauma is not just something that impacts children, it can impact anyone. But for this class specifically, we're thinking about adverse childhood experiences, so traumatic events and trauma that is occurring during childhood. And I wanted to read a quote from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network for you right now. And it states, a traumatic event is a frightening, dangerous, or violent event that poses a threat to a child's life or bodily integrity. Witnessing a traumatic event that threatens life or physical security of a loved one can also be traumatic. And so we see that when we're looking into adverse childhood experiences, we can categorize them by 3 different categories. And I've put an image for you to look at that. Abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And the severity and the variations of what adverse childhood experiences look like for someone differ. And so we can see that children may be abused physically, emotionally, or sexually, also physically and emotionally neglected. We may see that there is mental illness or substance abuse within the household. We may see that children are experiencing violence within their communities or their household. Children could also be experiencing events such as discrimination, or they could be noticing that their family members are in acts of terrorism, or again, like I said, violent communities, so witnessing domestic abuse or witnessing a serious accident or a family member who is injured, parental loss, so a parent who has died or is incarcerated, for example. So there's many different things that could be traumatic in a child's life and cause traumatic stress and toxic stress. And so it's important for us to recognize the varying categories in which a child may be experiencing or have experienced a traumatic event, and how do we support them. And so that's what this course is going to be all about, is how do we target young children and recognize that there are different factors that are influencing their development. And on the next slide, I have another image that just goes more into childhood trauma. It revisits some of the topics that we were already discussing related to the long-term impacts, as well as aspects about how the brain is impacted due to childhood trauma. So make sure to take a peek at that just to have kind of a more well-rounded understanding. Also take a peek at this article link about childhood trauma. And then on the next few slides, we'll discuss some of the factors that influence trauma, as well as how ACEs impact children's development. I did want to show a couple different areas that may be influencing trauma. So these are just some factors, and we'll continue to talk more about a variety of different factors that may influence trauma and look at some of the research. So for starters, we can take a peek at racism, disability, and gender. So we do see that children of color are at a higher risk than children who are not of color for exposure to trauma within their community, violence within the community, as well as witnessing domestic violence. And we see specifically that a study done in 2018 looked at the different ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, and that African American and Latino children were more likely to experience at least one ACE in comparison to their Caucasian and Asian peers. So do consider that children of color are at a higher risk for exposure to trauma. And this also can be looked at depending on the area that children are living in, the neighborhoods, socioeconomic status can play into this. We can also take a deeper dive into culture and different types of traditions and values that are shared amongst others. We see that socioeconomic factors, so the structural disadvantages that may be influencing different communities where we might have higher poverty rates as well as higher numbers of children of color within those areas. So many different aspects of racism that could be contributing to influences of trauma, as well as the microaggressions, the daily verbal and visual behaviors or environmental integrities towards individuals of color that may be resulting in acts of trauma. We can also see that areas like disability can influence trauma, and that individuals with identified disabilities are more likely to experience ACEs than their peers, especially individuals who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. They're at higher rates for abuse and neglect during childhood, and we see that children who might be expressing challenging behaviors are at more of a risk to experience trauma, which can lead to diagnoses or misdiagnoses in some cases. And the amount of individuals who may be undiagnosed with a disability, such as an intellectual or developmental disability, that could lead to areas of trauma is more prevalent. Another area is gender. We see that girls are more prone to ACEs in all categories than boys are, specifically when looking at sexual and physical abuse, that this is a higher rate for them, and that boys are more likely to experience non-sexual assaults, traffic incidents or accidents, injuries in that regard, witnesses to more violence than girls. And girls often are internalizing their responses in areas like anxiety and depression. And we see that boys are more likely to externalize, so they're more likely to engage in that fight response, whereas girls are more likely to engage in the flight or freeze response. So boys externalize, they might be more angry or disassociative, they may be experiencing first or second hand trauma. Again, it depends on the household and what types of trauma is going on, but regardless, trauma is the violent event, whether it is happening to the child themselves or they're witnessing something. And people who identify as transgender were 28% more likely to experience physical violence than individuals who identify as cisgender. So do keep in mind that there are many different factors within a diverse community that could be contributing to higher rates of trauma in childhood. On this slide, you'll see some examples of the developmental impacts that children may experience if adverse childhood experiences are occurring in their lives or have occurred. So they may have limited ability to use their words and represent different concepts within their life, see other points of view from adults, children, anyone. That is decreased. Delays in language development. Now, this could be that they are developmentally delayed. They already have a recognized disability or delay, or they're having regression within their language, or they are not comfortable in communicating or speaking out due to the fear of what could happen as a reprimand to talking out. We can also see that ACEs lead to difficulty with attention and memory. So thinking about children who are sent to school, they have a difficult time paying attention to the lectures, staying on task, being able to remember things, being able to engage effectively with their peers. Lack of executive function, so their ability to stay on task, to get things done, their ability to work through and solve problems, all of these cognitive functions are limited and potentially delayed. We see that children also may struggle with social and emotional skills, so lacking the ability to regulate themselves and their emotions and have emotional control. So this could potentially be that on and off switch for their fight or flight or freeze response is out of whack. And so they may have difficulty in controlling their emotional responses. If there is a child who gets frustrated and hits them, they may go into complete disarray and they may have difficulty in controlling their ability to respond appropriately or to solve a problem. They may have difficulty in managing emotions when big feelings come about. They also might have difficulty with relationships and showing empathy, as well as having healthy relationships with others. We may see difficulty in children's relationships forming with themselves. So having difficulty in confidence and self-awareness and recognition of their own skills and abilities, this could be decreased. We see that children may misinterpret social cues. So if somebody's joking or if they're sending them a signal through their facial expressions or body language, children may misinterpret that or think something is happening when it's not. They may also then have difficulty with relationships because they misinterpret social cues about what's going on in certain moments, or they may respond inappropriately to situations due to their lack of understanding for the situation itself. We see that potentially children could have poor motor skills and problems with sensory integration. So depending on the type of trauma that they're experiencing, they may have sensitivity to light and sounds and different types of textures. And so this could lead to an inability or lack of confidence in engaging with different types of materials. So for example, if you present children in your toddler or preschool classroom with an intriguing sensory activity, they may be more likely to not engage or shy away or fearful of trying this due to their sensory integration issues at that time. We also just might see in general many different challenges within a play setting. So this could be playing by themselves, interacting and playing with others. This could be the types of materials or how the environment is set up. This could be in how children engage in the dramatic play center, how they're communicating with one another. If we're thinking about older children, as we're starting to get into academics, the different types of play are going to look different. But as we focus on early childhood, majority of the day is spent playing. And so we're going to want to take a deeper dive into what play challenges look like, how do we support young children, and recognizing these different impacts on children's development is a good starting point so that we can better understand what areas we may need to work on for each individual child, because not every child is going to have the same impacts due to their ACEs. We may see some overlap depending on how many children in the classroom we have that are experiencing ACEs, but there could be a wide range and a scale of what that's going to look like. And that's all I have for you today, folks. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.